She held the coffee pot in her trembling hands. 1 cup, that's all it would take. 1 cup of coffee, and she'd lose her job. Lose her income. Maybe lose everything. But the young woman sitting in front of her, milkshake dripping from her hair, burns from cigarettes on her back, tears in her eyes, hadn't done anything wrong. She'd just sat down. She'd just asked to be treated like a human being. Geneva Tisdale had a choice to make. Follow the rules, or follow her heart. What happened next changed her. Life forever. If you've ever wondered what you'd do when faced with an impossible choice, when doing the right thing could cost you everything, then this story is for you. Hit that like button. Right now, subscribe to Truly Black and White. Get ready for one of the most powerful, untold stories of the civil rights movement. This is the story of a waitress who history forgot, but the people she helped, they never forgot her. Let's begin. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. in the small house on Maple Street. Geneva Tisdale's eyes opened in the darkness. She could hear her husband Frank already stirring, getting ready for his shift at the textile mill. In the next room, her 2 children, Sarah, age 6, and Tommy, age 4, were still sleeping. Geneva rubbed her eyes and swung her legs out of bed. Her feet touched the cold wooden floor. Another Monday, another shift at Woolworth's. She moved quietly through her morning routine, made coffee, fixed Frank's lunch, 2 bologna sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of sweet tea. Kissed him goodbye as he headed out the door at 6:15. Then she got herself ready. Put on her waitress uniform, a simple blue dress with a white collar and white apron, pinned her hair back. Applied a little lipstick. Slipped on her comfortable shoes, the ones that wouldn't hurt after standing for 8 hours. By 6:45 a.m., Geneva was walking through the employee entrance of the F.W. Woolworth Company store on South Elm Street. She'd worked there for 3 years now. 3 years of serving coffee, taking orders, wiping down counters, and collecting tips. It wasn't her dream job. When she was younger, Geneva had dreamed of being a teacher. But her family couldn't afford to send her to college, so she'd gotten married at 19, had babies by 22, and by 28. She was a lunch counter waitress trying to make ends meet, $5 a day, plus tips. In 1960, for a woman with limited education, it was one of the better jobs you could get. It paid the rent. It put food on the table. It kept the lights on. Geneva tied her apron tight around her waist and surveyed her station. The lunch counter stretched 66 feet long with 66 matching red vinyl stools. Each stool was bolted to the floor. Each had a worn spot on the seat from years of customers sitting, eating, chatting, living their lives. She began her routine. Fill the coffee urns. Check that the sugar dispensers were full. Make sure the salt and pepper shakers were clean. Wipe down the counter until it gleamed. Stack the menus. Count the silverware. The store opened at 7 a.m. By 7:15, the first customers trickled in. By 8 o'clock, the morning rush was in full swing. Businessmen grabbing coffee and toast before work. Secretaries meeting for breakfast. Elderly couples sharing. Eggs in conversation. Geneva knew most of them by name. Mr. Patterson always ordered his eggs over easy with bacon, no toast. Mrs. Henderson liked her coffee with 2 creams and 3 sugars. Young Billy Morrison came in every Saturday for a chocolate milkshake. This was Geneva's world. Small, predictable, safe. But there was one rule that everyone understood. Even though it was never written on any menu or posted on any sign, the lunch counter was for white customers only. Black customers could enter Woolworth's. They could shop. They could buy clothes, toys, household items, school supplies. Woolworth's was happy to take their money, but they could not sit at the lunch counter. They could not order a meal. It could not be served. It was segregation. It was Jim Crow. It was the law in the South. It was the way things had always been. Geneva had been trained on what to do if a black customer ever tried to sit at the counter. Don't serve them. Don't acknowledge them. Get the manager immediately. In 3 years, it had never happened. Black customers knew the rules. They didn't try to sit. They didn't make trouble. They just ... accepted it until that Monday afternoon at 4:30 p.m. Geneva was refilling the ketchup bottles when she noticed them. For young black men entering the store, they were dressed nicely dressed shirts, ties, neat pants. They were polite, quiet, well-mannered. They walked to a counter near the entrance and made some small purchases. Geneva saw them carefully fold their receipts and put them in their pockets. Proof of purchase. Proof that Woolworths was happy to take their money. Then they did something that made Geneva's heart stop. They walked to the lunch counter, and they sat down. Not in the back, not hiding. Right in the middle, for young black men sitting on the red vinyl stools. Their hands folded on the counter, their faces calm. The entire store seemed to freeze. White customers stopped mid-bite. Other waitresses stopped pouring coffee. Everyone stared. Geneva felt her pulse racing. Her hands went cold. She knew what this meant. She'd been warned about this, trained for this, but standing there, looking at these four young men, something felt ... different. They weren't causing trouble. They weren't shouting or being disruptive. They weren't drunk or rowdy. They just sat there, quietly, waiting to be served. One of them, Geneva would later learn his name was Franklin McCain, looked at her with kind eyes. His voice was polite, respectful, gentle. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'd like a cup of coffee, please." Geneva opened her mouth. No words came out. What was she supposed to say? What was she supposed to do? Before she could figure it out, she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, angry footsteps. Clarence Harris, the lunch counter manager, pushed past her. His face was stern, his voice firm. "I'm sorry, but we don't serve Negroes here." Another one of the students, Joseph McNeil, pulled out his receipt. He held it up calmly. "I beg to disagree, sir. You just served me at a counter 2 feet away." He pointed to where they'd made their purchase. "Why is it that you serve me at one counter and deny me at another?" The logic was undeniable, unshakable. Woolworths was perfectly happy to take black customers' money for merchandise, but not for food, not for service, not for dignity. Clarence's jaw tightened. "Those are the rules. You need to leave." "We're not leaving," Franklin McCain said quietly. "We'll just sit here." And that's exactly what they did. They sat there for an hour and a half. Until the store closed at 5:30 p.m., they didn't order again. They didn't argue. They just sat, dignified and determined. Geneva served customers around them. White customers who glared at the students, who muttered under their breath, who made comments loud enough for everyone to hear. What do they think they're doing? Someone should call the police. This is disgraceful. But Geneva kept working, pouring coffee, taking orders, clearing plates. And all the while she could feel the weight of those 4 young men sitting there. When the store finally closed and the students left, Geneva untied her apron with shaking hands. She walked to the employee exit in a daze. That night, lying in bed next to Frank, she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing their faces, for young men, barely older than teenagers, sitting with such dignity, such courage. What must it feel like, she wondered, to sit somewhere and be told you don't belong? To have money in your pocket but be denied service? To be treated as less than human simply because of the color of your skin? What? Geneva stared at the ceiling until dawn broke. She had no idea that this was only the beginning. Geneva arrived at work wondering if the students would return. Part of her hoped they wouldn't. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe yesterday was enough to make their point. But at 4 p.m., they came back. And they weren't alone. This time, there were 23 students. 23 young black men and women dressed in their Sunday best, walking calmly to the lunch counter and sitting down. 20-3. Geneva single quotes a stomach dropped. This wasn't going away. The other waitresses, Betty, Margaret, and Susie, exchanged nervous glances. What were they supposed to do? Ignore 23 people sitting at their counter? Clarence Harris was there immediately, his voice louder this time. "I've already told you, we don't serve Negroes here. Need to leave?" But the students didn't leave. They pulled out textbooks, notebooks, pens, and they studied. They sat at Woolworth's lunch counter doing their homework. Wednesday, February 3rd. 63 students, Thursday, February 4th, over 300 students. The sit-in had spread too. The SH Crest store next door. White students from local colleges had joined the black students. They sat together, integrated, united. The lunch counter had transformed from a place of business into a battlefield. Not a violent one, the students were committed to nonviolence, but a moral one. Geneva watched as her workplace became ground zero for something much bigger than serving coffee and sandwiches. The white customers' reactions varied wildly. Some left immediately, uncomfortable with the integration, muttering about how things used to be better. Others stayed specifically to heckle the students, hurling insults across the counter. "Go back where you came from. You don't belong here. This is a white establishment." But a few customers, just a few, looked at the students with something that might have been respect, admiration even. They'd eat their meals quickly and leave, but Geneva saw the way they watched the students. With wonder, with recognition of what was happening, Geneva, her fellow waitresses, found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. Their orders from management were crystal clear. Do not serve the Negro students, do not engage with them. Treat them as if they are invisible. But how do you treat human beings as invisible when they're sitting 3 feet in front of you? The students were unfailingly polite. They didn't demand service. They didn't cause disruptions. They studied, they read, talked quietly amongst themselves, and they waited. On Wednesday afternoon, Geneva was wiping down the counter when a young student, his name tag said William, spoke softly. "Excuse me, ma'am." Geneva froze. She wasn't supposed to respond. Wasn't supposed to acknowledge them. "Could you please move this ashtray? I need to set down my textbook." It was such a small request. Such a human request. William wasn't asking for service. He wasn't challenging her. He just needed space for his book. Geneva's hands moved before her brain could stop them. She moved the ashtray 6 inches to the left. "There you go," she said quietly. "Thank you, ma'am," William replied with a gentle smile. It was a 10-second interaction. Meaningless, really. Moving an ashtray, but Clarence saw it. During her break, he pulled Geneva into the back room. His finger jabbed toward her face. "Don't engage with them." Each word was punctuated with anger. Don't speak to them. Don't acknowledge them. Don't even look at them. "If you can't follow these simple rules, Geneva, you can find another job. Do you understand me?" Geneva nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir. Good, because I won't warn you again." Geneva needed this job. Frank's paycheck from the mill covered the rent, but barely. Her wages paid for groceries, utilities, the kids' clothes, the doctor visits when they got sick. Without her income, they'd be drowning. So she nodded. She agreed. She went back to work. But inside, something was changing by the end of the first week. The Greensboro Sit-Ins had become national news. Reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, newspapers from across America descended on this small North Carolina city. Photographers captured images that would become iconic. Young black students sitting at lunch counters, their faces serious and determined. White waitresses standing behind counters, forbidden to serve them. The contrast, the injustice, the quiet revolution. One evening, Geneva opened the Greensboro Daily News and saw herself in a photograph on the front page. There she was, standing behind the counter in her uniform, holding a coffee pot, looking at the seated students. The caption read, "Woolworth's waitresses refuse service to Negro students."
Ow.
Geneva stared at that caption for a long time. Refuse service. But that wasn't accurate, was it? She wasn't refusing. She was being ordered not to serve them. There was a difference, wasn't there? Or maybe there wasn't. Maybe following an unjust order was the same as choosing to do the unjust thing yourself. That night, Geneva asked herself the question that would haunt her for days. If I'm just following orders, does that make it right? She remembered something. Her father had told her when she was a little girl, "Geneva, if something doesn't sit right in your gut, it probably isn't right in your heart either." This didn't sit right in her gut. Geneva woke up that morning with a knot in her stomach. Saturdays were always the busiest days at Woolworth's, but this Saturday felt different. Dangerous. She'd heard rumors that some local white teenagers were planning to teach those students a lesson. She'd heard talk at church, whispers in the grocery store, threats made in dark corners. When she arrived at work, the tension was already thick. Over 300 students had shown up for the sit. Every seat at the lunch counter was filled. Students stood in the aisles. The store was packed wall-to-wall, and then they arrived. A group of about 20 white teenagers, boys mostly. But a few girls too swaggered into Woolworths. They weren't there to shop. They weren't there to eat. They were there to intimidate, to hurt, to punish. They stood behind the seated students and began their assault. They blew cigarette smoke directly into the students' faces. They flicked ashes onto their clothing. They put out lit cigarettes on the students' backs. Geneva could smell burning fabric and skin. They poured Coca-Cola over students' heads. They dumped food on them, spit on them, and the names they called them. Geneva had never heard such vile, hateful language in her life. But the students didn't move. They didn't fight back. They didn't yell. They didn't even turn around, too. Look at their attackers. They had been trained in nonviolence by their teachers and mentors. They sat there, absorbing the abuse, their faces calm, their eyes forward, their hands folded on the counter. Geneva watched in horror as a white teenage boy grabbed a full milkshake from the counter, a milkshake she had just made for a white customer, and poured it slowly, deliberately, over a young black woman's head. The thick, cold liquid ran down the woman's face, into her eyes, through her hair, soaking her nice Sunday dress. Pink strawberry milkshake dripping everywhere. The teenager laughed. His friends laughed. Some of the white customers laughed, but the young woman, Geneva, would later learn her name was Clara, simply closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath, reached for a napkin from the dispenser, and wiped her face with quiet dignity. She didn't leave her seat. She didn't cry out. She didn't strike back. She just sat there, covered in milkshake, trembling slightly, but refusing to abandon her post. Something broke inside Geneva in that moment. Not a loud break, not a dramatic snap. Just a quiet fracturing of whatever had been holding her together, holding her in place. Holding her silent, she looked at Clara, this young woman who had been burned, mocked and humiliated, and she saw something that took her breath away. Courage. Real. True bone-deep courage. This young woman was showing more dignity and strength than Geneva had ever seen in her entire life. More than the men at her church who talked big about honor and respect. More than the politicians who gave speeches about American values. More than anyone, these students, these young people sitting at this counter, they were the brave ones. Not the white teenagers attacking them. Not the white customers laughing. Not the managers enforcing unjust rules. The students were the heroes. And what was Geneva? What was she being by standing behind this counter, following orders, serving everyone except the people who needed it most? She was being a coward. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about North versus South. This wasn't even about the law. This was about whether Geneva Tisdale could look at herself in the mirror, whether she could look her children in the eye and tell them she had done the right thing when it mattered most. This was about her soul. Clarence was busy trying to keep the situation from exploding into a full riot. He was on the phone with the police, yelling at the white teenagers to calm down, trying to protect the store from liability. Geneva looked down at the counter, at the coffee pot in her hand. Her hand started to shake. She knew what she had to do, and she knew what it would cost her, but she also knew she couldn't not do it. She filled a clean cup with hot coffee. Her hands trembled so badly that some spilled over the side. She grabbed a napkin to wipe it clean. Then she walked over to Clara. Clara was still wiping milkshake from her face. Her eyes were closed. She looked exhausted, humiliated, but she hadn't moved from her seat. Geneva set the cup of coffee down in front of her. The sound of the cup hitting the counter seemed to echo through the entire store. "Here," Geneva said quietly. Her voice cracked. On the house, Clara's eyes opened. She looked up at Geneva with an expression of pure shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara whispered, "Thank you." The entire lunch counter fell, silent. Everyone had seen it. White customers, students, the teenagers, everyone. The white waitress had just served a black student. Geneva heard Clarence's voice cutting through the silence, furious and sharp. "Geneva, what the hell do you think you're doing?" He pushed through the crowd, his face red with rage. Veins bulged in his neck. His fists were clenched. Geneva stood up straight. For the first time in days, maybe years, she felt like she could breathe. Like a weight she'd been carrying had finally fallen away. "I'm serving a customer," Geneva said. Her voice was steady now, strong. "Someone who's been sitting here for hours. Someone who's been abused and harassed, and she hasn't done anything wrong. She's just a young woman who wants a cup of coffee." "You're fired," Clarence spat. "Get your things and get out of my store now." Geneva untied her apron slowly. Carefully, she folded it and set it on the counter. She looked at Clara one more time. The young woman's eyes were filled with tears, but she was smiling, actually smiling. "It was worth it," Geneva said quietly, and she meant it. She walked through the employee door, collected her purse from her locker, and left F.W. Woolworth Company. For the last time, when she stepped out onto South Elm Street, the February air hit her face, cold and sharp and clean. Geneva Tisdale had just lost her job, lost her steady income, possibly lost her future, but she had found something else. Her dignity. The walk home that evening was the longest of Geneva's life. Her feet moved automatically, carrying her down familiar streets, but her mind was racing. What had she done? What was she going to tell Frank? How would they pay the bills? But underneath the fear and panic, there was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. When she opened the front door to their small house, Frank was already home from his shift. He was sitting at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes. Reading the newspaper, he looked up when she walked in early. "Geneva, what are you doing home?" She set her purse down, took off her coat, sat down across from him. "I got fired." Frank put down the newspaper slowly. "Fired? Why?" Geneva told him everything, about the students, about the harassment, about Clara and the milkshake, about the cup of coffee. When she finished, Frank was quiet for a long time, so long that Geneva started to worry. Money was always tight. They lived paycheck to paycheck. Losing her income wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially devastating. Finally, Frank reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. That was it. No lecture, no anger, no how could you. Just quiet, steady support. Geneva started crying. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. But if she thought Frank's reaction was the end of it, she was wrong. The community's reaction was brutal. In 1960 Greensboro, a white woman who sided with black students in a sit-in wasn't just controversial. She was seen as a traitor to her race. By Sunday, the whole neighborhood knew what she'd done. Geneva attended church like she did every week, but the whispers followed her down the aisle. Her usual seat in the third pew, suddenly full. People who used to greet her warmly now looked away. Mrs. Patterson, who had been her friend for years, walked right past her without a word. Monday morning, Geneva's neighbor Mrs. Henderson stopped. Returning her waves. Tuesday, someone left a note in her mailbox. "Go live with them if you love them so much." Wednesday night, the phone rang at 2 a.m. Geneva stumbled to answer it, thinking it might be an emergency. A man's voice, muffled and angry. "N, our lover. You and your family better watch yourselves." Then click. Dial, tone. Frank wanted to call the police, but Geneva knew it wouldn't help. The police weren't exactly on their side these days. The threats escalated. On Friday evening, Geneva was making dinner when she heard the crash, glass shattering in the living room. Tommy started crying. She ran in to find their front window broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. A brick sat in the middle of the room with a piece of paper tied around it. Frank grabbed the note. Before Geneva could, he read it, his jaw clenching, then crumpled it in his fist. "What does it say?" Geneva asked. "It doesn't matter," Frank said.
"Hi."
But she could see his hands shaking. Later, when he was asleep, Geneva uncrumpled the note. "Lover, you're next." The harassment extended to their children. Sarah came home from school crying one day. The other kids had made a circle around her at recess, chanting, "Your mama loves NRS. Your mama loves NRS." When Sarah tried to tell the teacher had said, "Well, Sarah, maybe your mother shouldn't have done what she did, Tommy." Only 4 years old? Didn't understand why his friends' mothers suddenly wouldn't let them play at his house. Anymore, Geneva felt like she was drowning. Every day brought new reminders of what she'd lost. Not just her job, but her social standing, her community, her children's innocence, and finding another job is impossible. She applied at 3 different diners, to drugstore lunch counters, cafe, a restaurant. Every single one turned her away. Word had spread. That's the woman who got fired from Woolworths for serving Negroes. No one wanted to hire her. No one wanted the controversy. No one wanted a troublemaker. One manager actually laughed in her face. "You think I'm going to hire someone who can't follow simple rules? Get out of my establishment." Money got tight. It's really tight. They stopped buying meat except on Sundays. Geneva started making 1 pot of soup last for 3 days. She let out the hems on Sarah's dresses because they couldn't afford new ones. There were nights when Geneva lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd made the right choice. She'd lost her job, her reputation, the respect of her white community. Her children were suffering. Her husband was working extra shifts to make ends meet. For what? For 1 cup of coffee? Had it been worth it? But then, something unexpected happened. It started with a letter. Geneva found it in the mailbox one Tuesday afternoon. There's no return address. She opened it carefully. "Dear Mrs. Tisdale, my name is Marcus Johnson. I'm a student at North Carolina A&T. I was sitting at the lunch counter the day you served Clara that cup of coffee. I want you to know that what you did gave us hope. We were starting to believe that no white person in Greensboro would ever stand with us, that we were completely alone, but you showed us we were wrong. You showed us that courage exists in unexpected places, that some people will choose what's right even when it costs them everything. Thank you. Thank you for seeing us as human beings. Thank you for risking your livelihood. Thank you for giving us hope." With deep gratitude, Marcus Geneva read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down. Her face, more letters came. From students. From their families. From black churches in Greensboro. From people as far away as New York and California who had read about the sit-ins in their local newspapers. They thanked her. They told her she had inspired them. They told her that her small act of kindness had meant more than she could possibly know. And then, on a Saturday morning, there was a knock at the door. Geneva opened it to find Clara standing on her porch. Behind Clara were about 15 other people. Men, women, some elderly, some young. "Mrs. Tisdale," Clara said, "we heard you lost your job for helping me. For helping us." Geneva nodded, unable to speak. "You stood up for us when you had everything to lose," Clara continued. "Now we're standing up for you?" The church group had collected money, small amounts from dozens of families. $1 here, 50 cents there. $5 from a family who probably couldn't spare it. They handed Geneva an envelope with $47 inside. "Not much," Clara said, "but it'll help with groceries, with bills, and we'll keep collecting. Every week, until you get back on your feet." Geneva couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She pulled Clara into a hug. "You didn't have to do this," Geneva whispered. "Yes, we did," Clara replied, "because you didn't have to serve me that coffee. But you did anyway." Over the following weeks, the black community in Greensboro became Geneva's lifeline. When she needed groceries and had no money, Clara's church delivered food to her door. When Sarah needed new school shoes, a black church took up a collection. When Geneva finally found a job washing dishes at a small restaurant on the black side of town, the owner, Mr. Williams, paid her fairly and treated her with respect. Geneva had lost her white community, but she had gained something else. She had gained the friendship and respect of people who understood what sacrifice meant, who understood what courage cost, who knew that doing the right thing didn't always come with rewards. Across the South, as the sit-in movement spread like wildfire, other waitresses and service workers faced similar impossible choices. In Nashville, Tennessee, a waitress named Barbara worked at McClellan's lunch counter. When sit-in students came to her counter, she was ordered not to serve them. For 3 days, she followed orders. But on the 4th day, she couldn't take it anymore. During her lunch break, she slipped sandwiches and drinks to the students wrapped them in napkins, passed them quietly under the counter like contraband. A customer saw her and reported it to management. Barbara was fired within the hour. She never found another waitress job in Nashville. The restaurant industry blacklisted her. She had to move to Cincinnati, Ohio, to find work in Atlanta, Georgia. A lunch counter worker named Mary witnessed something that changed her forever. Her manager, furious at the sit-in students, told Mary to pour scalding hot coffee on a student's lap. To accidentally spill it, Mary looked at the student, a young man reading a chemistry textbook hand, then looked at her manager. "No," she said simply. "I'm not going to hurt anyone." "Then you're fired." "Fine." Mary walked out. She never regretted it. Years later, in an interview, she said, "I couldn't live with myself if I'd hurt that young man. Some things are more important than a paycheck." In Richmond, Virginia, a white waitress named Helen made a different choice. She didn't serve the black students. She didn't break the rules. But during her break, she sat down next to them at the counter. "If they can't eat here," she announced loudly, "then I won't either." She was fired on the spot and blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. These women's names are largely forgotten by history. There are no monuments to them, no streets named after them, no textbooks that tell their stories. They simply made a choice in a moment of crisis to do what they believed was right, and they paid for it. But it's important to understand that not all waitresses made this choice. In fact, most didn't. Most continued to follow the rules. They served white customers and ignored black students. They kept their heads down. They kept their jobs. And we can't judge them too harshly. It's easy sitting here decades later, safe and comfortable, to say what we would have done, to claim we would have been brave. But these women had children to feed, bills to pay, mortgages and rent and medical expenses. They lived in communities that would punish them severely for stepping out of line. Fear is powerful. The need to survive is powerful. Not everyone can be a hero. That's okay. But we can honor the ones who were, because their courage mattered. Let's hear what the students themselves said about these waitresses. Franklin McCain, one of the original Greensboro Four, was interviewed years later about the sit-ins. He was asked if any white people had supported them. As he said, his eyes distant with memory. "There was a waitress. I don't remember her name, but I remember she brought us coffee one day, even though she wasn't supposed to. Her manager fired her right there, right in front of everyone." Paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'll never forget the look on her face. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She just looked ... peaceful, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and finally put it down." Joseph McNeil, another of the Greensboro Four, said in a later interview, "People asked me if I was scared during the sit-ins. Of course. We knew we might be arrested, beaten, killed. But you know who else was brave? Those waitresses." He leaned forward, his voice passionate. "They didn't have to risk anything. They could have just kept their heads down and kept their jobs. Their communities wouldn't have punished them for ignoring us. That's what was expected. But the ones who helped us, who showed us kindness, they were as brave as anyone in the movement." The Woolworth's sit-in in Greensboro lasted from February 1 to July 25, 1960, 175 days. On July 25th, the lunch counter was finally desegregated. The first black customers to be officially served were 3 members of Woolworth's own staff who had worked in the kitchen for years, cooking food they were never allowed to eat at the counter. Their names were Geneva McKissick, Susie Morrison, and Maddie Long. They sat down at the counter in their uniforms, and they were served. By that time, the sit-in movement had spread to 55 cities and 13 states. Over 70,000 people participated. More than 3,000 were arrested. The movement didn't just desegregate lunch counters. It energized the entire civil rights. It's a movement. It showed that nonviolent direct action could work. it inspired the freedom. Rides, it inspired the Birmingham campaign. It inspired the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. would give his "I Have a Dream" speech. And at the heart of it all were young people, black and white, who refused to accept injustice, who were willing to sacrifice for what was right. Students like Azell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, and allies like Geneva, Barbara, Mary, and Helen. Ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. Now I need to tell you something important. Something honest. Geneva Tisdale's name won't appear in the historical record of the Greensboro Sit-Ins because Geneva Tisdale, as a specific individual, doesn't exist in documented history. The truth is, most of the waitresses at Woolworth's during the sit-ins remained anonymous. Their names weren't recorded in newspapers. Their stories weren't preserved in archives. History moved on without remembering them, but we know from oral histories and interviews with the students that some waitresses did show kindness. Some did face consequences for it. Some did lose their jobs. The character of Geneva in this story represents those women. She's based on accounts from students who remember acts of kindness from waitresses' coffee served when it shouldn't have been. Kind words whispered when no one was looking. Small gestures of humanity in an inhumane situation. She's based on documented cases of white service workers across the South who lost their jobs for supporting integration. She's based on the reality that there were white allies in the movement, even in unexpected places. Her specific story, her name, her family. Her exact actions, those are representative rather than documentary. But does that make her story any less true? Because this is the tragedy of history. We remember the leaders. We forget the followers. We remember Martin Luther King Jr., but we forget the thousands of everyday people who marched behind him. We remember Rosa Parks, but we forget the dozens of other black women who refused to give up their seats before her. We remember the Greensboro Four, but we forget the waitresses, the janitors, the cooks, the ordinary workers who made small, courageous choices. These people mattered. Their choices mattered, and even if we don't know their names, we can honor what they did. So when I tell you about Geneva, I'm telling you about every waitress who served when she wasn't supposed to. Every. A lunch counter worker who quit rather than participate in injustice. Every ordinary person who looked at an unjust system and said, "Not on my watch." Their names may be lost. Their courage echoes through history. There's a quote from Edmund Burke that says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The waitresses at Woolworth's were put in a position where doing nothing was the easy choice. Keep your head down. Follow the rules. Don't get involved. Don't make waves. Protect your job. Protect your family. Protect yourself. Most did nothing. We can understand why. They had families, responsibilities. They lived in a society that would punish them if you're stepping out of line. But some chose to do something. They served coffee. They offered a kind word. They sat down in solidarity. They quit rather than participate in injustice. These small acts didn't end segregation. Geneva's one cup of coffee didn't change the law, but it mattered. It mattered to Clara, sitting there with a milkshake in her hair, tears in her eyes, wondering if any white person would ever see her as human. It mattered to the students who witnessed it, who saw that not all white people supported this evil system. It mattered to history, even if history didn't always remember their names. And it matters to us today, because we all face moments where we have to choose. Moments where we can stay silent or speak up. Moments where we can go along with injustice or stand against it. Moments where we can do nothing or do something. These moments don't always feel historic. They feel ordinary. They feel like just another day at work. It's just another difficult situation. Just another time when it would be easier to look the other way. Your moment might be at work. You see a coworker being treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or identity. Your moment might be at a family dinner, when someone makes a racist joke and everyone laughs except you. Your moment might be online, when you see injustice happening and have to decide whether to speak up or scroll past. Your moment might be small, quiet. Seemingly, it's insignificant. but these ordinary moments shape who we are. They determine what kind of people we'll be, what kind of world we'll create. The students at Woolworths weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying to get a cup of coffee. They were trying to be treated like human beings. The waitresses who helped them weren't trying to be heroes either. They were just trying to do what felt right in that moment, but together. These ordinary people doing ordinary things changed America. That's the lesson of Woolworths. That's the lesson of the civil rights movement. That's the lesson we need too. Remember today, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. Sometimes courage is serving a cup of coffee when you're not supposed to. Sometimes courage is losing everything to keep your conscience clear. Sometimes courage is a mother choosing dignity over a paycheck because she wants to be able to look her children in the eye. We honor the students who sat at that counter. We honor the waitresses who stood behind it. We honor everyone who chose justice over comfort, who chose kindness over conformity, who chose to do something when doing nothing would have been so much easier. Their story is not just history, it's a mirror. It asks us, what will you do when your moment comes? When injustice is standing right in front of you, will you have the courage to do the right thing? The answer to that question will define not just who you are, but what kind of world we all live in. Because at the end of the day, this is what matters. Humanity has no color. Justice has no color. And courage. Courage looks like ordinary people making extraordinary choices. It looks like a 28-year-old waitress with 2 kids at home and $5 in her pocket, setting down a cup of coffee and saying, it was worth it. It looks like you choosing to stand up when everyone else sits down. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think about what you would do in that situation, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Truly Black and White for more untold stories from the civil rights movement, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Geneva? Would you have served that cup of coffee? Be honest. Because the only way we grow is by asking ourselves hard questions. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter, these voices matter, and your willingness to listen, to learn, and to reflect on your own choices. That matters too. Remember, history is not just something that happened to other people, it's happening right now, and you're a part of it. What role will you play?